sorry.
The movies start with Rick, a young man, takes care of his sick mother, ensuring she eats and takes her medication. One day, he finds her clutching a gun, murmuring Bible verses. Her eerie demeanor unsettles him. Before he can react, she apologizes and pulls the trigger. 3 years later, Rick struggles to rebuild his life. He searches for work in construction, only to find his old job taken. Desperate, he turns to his friend Jeremy, who helps him secure a spot despite his late arrival. While working, Rick accidentally injures himself and notices a woman in the garden, Antoinette. He politely asks for a first aid kit, but she refuses. "You got nothing inside I can use?" he asks. After explaining that he just needs to clean the wound to keep working, she finally relents. As he treats himself, a servant whispers something to Antoinette, and she quickly dismisses Rick. However, on his way out, he notices a room with cash placed on the table. Tempted by his poverty, he sneaks in and takes a single bill. Before he can leave, an old man, George Drayton, the mansion's owner, catches him. "Who are you?" he demands. Soon Antoinette arrives, furious, and fires Rick on the spot, vowing to ruin his chances of ever finding work again. Rick pleads, admitting his mistake and explaining that he was robbed that morning and needed money to survive. To his shock, Mr. Drayton forgives him and hands over the entire stack of cash as an advanced payment. That night, Rick moves in with Jeremy, who asks what he would do if he had billions. Rick dreams of luxury, fancy dinners, and rekindling things with his ex, Tanya. Jeremy laughs, calling Rick a failure who never follows through, hence his current broke situation. "You gotta stop starting what you can't finish," he says. The next day, Rick and Jeremy discuss their work and its purpose, but Antoinette interrupts, summoning Rick to Mr. Drayton. The old man reveals that he regrets having no family to inherit his wealth. He then asks Rick if he is religious. Rick admits he used to be. Drayton, once fatherless, now clings to religion in his final days. Then, he makes a chilling offer. "Let's get down to it. If you eat a meal made from my corpse, you'll inherit everything." Rick, horrified, assumes it's a joke, but Drayton insists. One meal, infinite wealth. Rick refuses, but Drayton insists Rick is the right person for this burden. This is a genuine offer. That night, Rick returns to find Jeremy throwing a party. Tanya is there, but before they can talk, Jeremy mocks Rick's failures. "What have you been up to? Living the dream?" Later, Tanya admits she never expected Rick to stay after his mother's death. Suddenly, Jeremy causes a drunken scene. The outburst is brutal and humiliating for Rick. "Get out of here, dude. Are you serious? You ungrateful piece of..." Rick, devastated, sits in his room, staring at his gun, considering the worst. Instead, he puts it down and breaks down in tears. The next morning, he frantically cold calls for jobs. Nothing. Then, a knock at the door. A man hands Rick an envelope and informs him that his presence is requested at the mansion. Inside the envelope is an invitation, a suit, the attire for the event. "The car will be waiting outside," the man says, his respectful tone invoking suspicion in Jeremy. Rick arrives at Mr. Drayton's mansion, where Antoinette informs him that Mr. Drayton passed away earlier that day. She hands him a contract, explaining that if Rick eats a meal prepared from Drayton's body, he will inherit all his wealth. However, you must eat every last bite, and no one outside the estate can ever know, or you will lose everything. Rick struggles with the decision, but after a long pause, agrees. Soon, a meal is served. Plates are placed on Mr. Drayton's corpse. Rick forces himself to eat dish after dish until the final bits are placed directly on Drayton's chest. Antoinette reminds him, every last crumb, and somehow Rick does it. When he finishes, Antoinette gives him a card with Mr. Drayton's final words, "It is necessary to end the meal." It states that Rick takes on all of Drayton's burdens and offers his own soul in return. Without thinking clearly, Rick signs the contract and leaves. But it's clear he is already starting to feel unwell. That night, Rick collapses into bed, exhausted. When he closes his eyes, he finds himself underwater, surrounded by terrifying demonic creatures. He screams in fear as the vision overwhelms him. Be careful what you wish for. The next morning, Rick wakes up and notices a man staring at him in the hallway. When their eyes meet, the man runs away. Rick chases him but is stopped by Antoinette, who acts like nothing is wrong. "The mansion is now yours," she tells him. "You can hire or fire the staff as you wish." Rick, unsure of what to do with his new life, declines. Antoinette hands him an unlimited credit card. Enjoy your wealth rather than worry about its consequences. Later, Rick visits Jeremy's apartment to collect his things. He tries to give Jeremy some money, but Jeremy refuses. "I'll handle things on my own." Tanya sees Rick and asks if he won the lottery. "It's something even better," he replies. She asks if he's okay. "This isn't like you, Rick." He then suggests they go out like they used to, but Tanya hesitates. "I can't," she says. "Jeremy's waiting for me." That night, Rick goes to a club and orders a rare whiskey. A man nearby mocks him, questioning how he dares to order whiskey here. In response, Rick orders 2 bottles, one for himself and one for the man. "I'll take 2 of those." When Rick returns home, he starts drinking but suddenly sees a woman appear in front of him. He touches his face. His nose is bleeding. Before he can react, the woman disappears, then reappears and attacks him, screaming, "Why did you do this?" Suddenly, Rick finds himself underwater again, struggling to breathe. He wakes up, drenched and terrified. Panicked, he rushes downstairs to find Antoinette. "What was that thing I had to read at the end of the meal?" She stays calm, but Rick demands answers. Without hesitation, Antoinette hands him the statement. As Rick reads it again, a deep dread consumes him. Is that even possible? Antoinette explains that before Mr. Drayton died, he became obsessed with strange religious rituals to escape his fate, hell. Soon, Rick discovers a book about an old practice where families hired someone, usually a peasant, to eat a meal off a corpse, transferring the dead person's sins to the eater. These people were called sin eaters. Rick realizes this is what he has become. Am I a sin eater? Antoinette confirms it. Immense wealth always comes at a cost. This is the price you agreed to pay. Common sense kicks in. Rick panics. No, I gotta fix this. He rushes out of the house, ignoring Antoinette's pleas to calm down. Desperate for redemption, Rick goes to a church for confession. I know I've sinned, but I don't even understand my sins. The priest tells him, you must first acknowledge your wrongs before you can be forgiven. Without that, absolution isn't possible. Frustrated, Rick returns home and questions the servants about Mr. Drayton, but they all avoid him, refusing to speak. You know anything about Drayton hurting somebody? Silence. At this point, Rick probably wishes he could fire them all and hire people who actually answer questions. Rick demands answers from Annette, threatening her job if she doesn't tell him everything. Calmly, she hands him documents. Mr. Drayton's coroner report, crime scene photos, police records, and a taped confession. Rick learns that Mr. Drayton was suspected of murdering his wife Susan, who had been having an affair. Though Drayton always claimed innocence, Rick realizes the woman who attacked him was Susan's vengeful spirit. Shortly after, Rick returns to the church, confessing that he killed Susan. The priest asks why, but Rick, overwhelmed, says he doesn't know. He only regrets everything. As the priest prays, Susan's vengeful spirit reappears, trying to strangle Rick. Luckily, the priest's prayers drive her away, delivering Rick from immediate danger. Good thing holy prayers work faster than Rick's decision-making skills. The next day, Tanya calls, worried about Jeremy. She says he has been acting paranoid and distant, and she asks Rick to talk to him before it's too late. That night, Rick notices a dark figure standing silently near his couch. Suddenly, a lamp crashes to the floor. Rick freezes in fear when he sees a masked man moving toward him. He stumbles upstairs, searching for Annette, but instead, a ghostly child appears. Just as Rick panics, Annette walks in calmly, asking if he called for her. Speechless, Rick tries to explain what he saw. Annette then reveals a shocking truth. Mr. Drayton wasn't born wealthy. He had also been a sin eater, just like Rick. That's how he first gained his fortune. Sin eaters inherit the sins of their clients, taking on all their crimes and evil deeds. Annette tells Rick that everything he is experiencing, haunting visions, terrifying encounters, is the result of those sins. She warns him that this torment will never end. He saw the same things you did, she explains. She warns him that this torment will never end. He saw the same things you did, she explains. Over time, Drayton became consumed by the burden, living in constant fear, haunted by the same visions Rick now endures. Eventually, Drayton couldn't take it anymore and ended his own life, knowing his sins would be passed on. Rick asks how he can get rid of the sins. Annette says the only way is to pass them on to someone else willing to take his place. If he doesn't, he will carry them until his death, and even beyond, suffering for eternity. She advises him to enjoy his wealth while he can and offers him pills to help him cope. Rick refuses, determined to find another way. He returns to the church again, desperate for peace, but this time, the priest refuses to let him in. Even the priest is like, nope, not my problem, buddy. That night, unable to sleep, Rick finally gives in and takes the pills. As he lies in bed, a ghostly figure appears nearby. It vanishes, only to reappear moments later, looming over him. Rick panics, falling out of bed, his mouth foaming. Just then, Annette enters, but Rick is barely conscious. He hears his mother's voice and sees her standing before him. As he moves toward her, the vision suddenly shifts. His mother transforms into Tanya. Determined to break the cycle, Rick tells Annette he wants to try something different. Skeptical, she agrees to help but warns him that even Mr. Drayton never considered this option. She asks if he is truly ready to let go of everything. "Are you sure you're willing to let all this go?" He says he is. However, when she asks if he has someone in mind to pass the sins to, he hesitates. He then suggests Annette take them instead. If she does, she could finally have control over her own life. Annette hesitates, saying her contract might not allow it. Rick insists. He can't do this alone. Soon, Annette suggests Jeremy as the next sin eater. Rick refuses, saying he can't do that to someone he's known his whole life. Annette clarifies. She means someone desperate, capable of theft and violence. Suddenly, Rick sees a ghost behind her and grows frantic, insisting Jeremy cannot be the one. Just then, Jeremy calls in a panic, saying he's in trouble with dangerous people and needs money. Rick rushes over with cash, but when he arrives, he finds the place in shambles. Grabbing his gun, he prepares for the worst. Then he sees a ghost begging for help and fires in panic. When he looks again, horror washes over him. He has shot Tanya. Shocked, he stares at her lifeless body. Shortly after, Annette's driver arrives and pulls Rick away from the crime scene, taking him home. Annette reassures him, this will all be taken care of. Exhausted, Rick says he just wants it all to end. Annette tells him he knows what he must do. Rick decides to pass the curse to Jeremy and calls him over. Jeremy, distraught, says Tanya is dead. He blames himself, believing he could have saved her. Desperate, Jeremy asks to work for Rick. "I can help you with whatever, anything." Annette then reveals the truth. Rick wants Jeremy to become his sin eater. Jeremy must eat a meal from Rick's dead body to inherit his wealth. Shocked, Jeremy asks if Rick is dying. Annette explains that Rick has chosen this. He believes Jeremy can handle the burden. Shortly after, Rick lies on a table as Dr. Kildare prepares the ritual. Annette reassures him, it's going to work. Soon, Kildare administers a lethal injection, stopping Rick's heart. In another world, Rick wakes up and sees the spirits pleading for help. In the distance, he sees his mother. As he approaches, she transforms into Tanya. They apologize to each other before she vanishes. Suddenly, the ghosts turn on Rick, but his mother's spirit drives them away. Then, Rick gasps awake. Annette confirms Jeremy completed the ritual, recited the prayer, and has taken over Rick's life. He has already begun giving orders. Rick realizes the ghosts are gone. He is free. Annette states that Jeremy has embraced his new role and hopes Rick will do the same. 6 months later, Rick works as a construction worker, far from his old life. Meanwhile, Annette writes Jeremy's name in a book of past sin eaters. At the mansion, Jeremy is haunted by the same ghosts that tormented Rick. Annette listens as his terrified screams echo through the halls, her eyes glowing eerily, suggesting even more sin eaters will follow. Meanwhile, at the construction site, Rick takes a lunch break under a tree. He isn't alone. Tanya's ghost sits silently beside him, but it's clear he hasn't repented for killing her. Instead, he seems unbothered by her ghostly presence, as if accepting that some sins can never be erased. End of the movie. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments, like the video, and stay tuned for more recaps.